Hey, Virginia.
Hey, Mark.
Long time no talk.
Right. Looks like we've got 20 something so far. That's good.
Chairs, I think we're ready to kick it off whenever you are.
Okay. Well, it's my time. Good afternoon, everybody. Mark Zappi here, co-chair of the Science Advisory Group. It's my pleasure to open up the meeting and call it to order. Appreciate everybody being here. I know with your busy calendar, so I won't waste any more time. I'll pass the baton over to Lindsay and let her go through the roll call.
Members, if you don't mind unmuting yourself and stating your name verbally for the record. Dr. Virginia Burkett.
Present.
Dr. Mark Zappi.
Present.
Dr. Alex Polker.
Present.
Dr. Camille Stagg.
Present.
Dr. Carrie Castile. Don't see Carrie yet. Dr. Cheng Jiang.
Present.
Eric Smith. I don't see Eric either. Dr. Jean Sochi. Dr. KT Valsarat.
Here.
Dr. Kimberly Foster.
Here.
Dr. Mehi Zedun.
Present.
Dr. Monica Ferris. Dr. Peng Yin.
Present.
Dr. Raj Bhupathi.
Present.
And Dr. Khan.
Present.
Thank you, members and chairs. We do have a quorum.
Okay, this is Virginia. Can you hear me now?
We can't hear you, Virginia. We can.
You can't?
Can, yes.
Oh, good. Okay. Sorry, I've been having a little connectivity issues. Yes, just to join Mark and thanking everyone for attending this second full meeting of the Science Advisory Group of the Louisiana Climate Initiatives Task Force. We were all together last on February 24th for the all hands meeting of the full task force with the sectoral committees and the working groups. And for those who were not able to attend, the links to the presentations and reference materials were all mailed to the task force and working group members like us on February 26th. And then on March the 9th, the governor's office sent us all a file of all the Q&As that ensued after that or during that particular meeting. And that meeting focused on that Princeton presentation of the 5 different economically plausible, technologically feasible energy system pathways for the United States to reach net zero emissions by 2050. Of course, that's not focused on Louisiana, which is what our job is, but they did look at impacts on energy infrastructure, capital investment, employment, and so forth. So that was very informative. Then we had that presentation about state-led practices, the best practices that this group called the U.S. Climate Alliance had surveyed, and that was informative as well. And then we had a discussion of climate equity and defining equity and framing climate equity, and then a look at some possible ways to develop the action pathway. At that meeting, the template was discussed, and that is now live on the task force webpage. And the sectoral committees all have met the past 3 weeks, and they are working on actions and using this template. And I believe those are due at the end of April. And then in March, the governor's office has been meeting with the legal advisory group, the finance equity, and now finally the science advisory group. And so just picking up today, we're getting now, I think we've all kind of developed a, and we'll continue this today, developing a foundation for our work. And the briefings and the materials that we've been asked to review all help prepare us for the work that we are initiating in earnest now with activity. And there will be some things following this meeting that you'll be hearing about that we need your engagement in specifically. One of the charges to the SAG, of course, is the scientific and technical review of the updated greenhouse gas inventory, which is a focus of today's meeting. We'll also get a preview today of the tools that the state is considering to produce this net zero action plan for Louisiana. And I know a lot of us scratching our heads, well, how do you do this? And that all hands meeting was kind of got our minds wrapped around one approach that Princeton had developed. And now we're going to talk about one of the tools that the state is proposing that we use for the Louisiana action plan. And it's just one of the strategy portfolio elements that they're considering, but we'll hear about that. So the SAG, within a few days after this meeting, we'll have some assignments, and Mark will introduce you to this organizational concept that he's come up with, which I think is really good. And so at this point, Mark, did you have any additional comments that you'd like to make an introduction?
No, you did a fine job, and just again, thank everybody. So I think we're ready to move forward with the agenda.
Okay.
Virginia.
All right. So let me turn it over to Lindsay to introduce our presenter, David Dismukes from LSU, that did the inventory update or is doing it. Lindsay.
Thank you, Virginia. Would you mind doing an approval of the minutes before I open up?
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. Yes. The minutes were mailed out in your package for this meeting. I read through them, didn't see any edits that needed to be made. Did anyone notice any edits that they would like to propose be made in the minutes from our last meeting?
Make a motion that we accept the minutes.
I second the motion.
Okay. Motion proposed and seconded. Are there any objections to accepting the minutes as written?
No objection.
Okay. Thank you, Alex. All right. So we'll assume that they are approved or accept them as approved. And now I'll turn it over to Lindsay to introduce David. Thank you.
Thank you to both of our chairs for that great introduction. So as we're entering into this meeting, members, just for your awareness, from the first meeting of the Climate Task Force, the governor and our team has reiterated the significance in using the most up-to-date and accurate science to inform what emission reduction actions we prioritize and move forward throughout this effort. So in order to make well-informed decisions in this process, we realized that there was a need to commission a new update of our state greenhouse gas inventory from the LSU Center for Energy Studies, since the last iteration of the inventory was done in 2010 with 2005 data. And that serves us as a great baseline data from which we are reducing emissions, but it doesn't show us where we are now and where we need to go moving forward. So David Dismuke and LSU, through the support of some various state agencies, have worked the past few months and will continue working in the next few to provide this comprehensive update. And an important role for you all as science advisory members is in advising David and our team as we develop this update to ensure that it is comprehensive and it does help us and the Climate Task Force make informed decisions. So the chairs will outline what advising looks for you all briefly after David presents, but just wanted to provide that context for you on why we've invited David into this space and why the inventory is so central in this work. So with that, I will hand it over to David.
Okay, thank you, Lindsay. I'm having a few interconnection issues. So if for some reason I drop off, I'll jump back on again on another connection, but I want to throw that caveat out there in case something happens. It usually happens right when I start talking. Otherwise, it's usually fine. But I'm going to go through some slides this afternoon, actually, to talk about the greenhouse gas inventory and where we stand on it. As Lindsay said, we were commissioned to update the study that we've done at least 2 times before at the Center for Energy Studies. and to bring it up to the current time period, to the most available information and data, so that it could be used as a kicking off or a starting point for some of the other pathway analyses that I think you're going to discuss later. This afternoon, I'm going to go through a couple of things somewhat quickly. Some of this stuff is similar. If you saw the presentation I gave in December to the full task force, some of these first couple of sections are going to be similar, just to make sure we're all on the same page in terms of looking at historic trends on Louisiana overall carbon emissions. I'm going to talk some about what we did last time in the greenhouse gas inventory and how it's similar to the one that we're doing this year, which is actually a good thing and not a bad thing. I've got two different sectors or modules and results, and I'm going to walk through on fossil fuel combustion and electricity, just to kind of give you a feel for how the calculations work. I don't want to belabor them, but just to kind of give you an idea about how some typical big sectors work. Fossil fuel is going to comprise about 80 plus 90% of a lot of the emissions that we see in the state. And so it's an important module to look through and walk through. And I'll give you appreciation for how those are calculated. And then in the end, I'm going to wrap up and talk some about our next steps, where we're going, some things that I would like to invite you all to participate in and to provide us input on, and to provide a kind of a timeline on what we're looking at in terms of finishing this up. As Lindsay mentioned, we've got a pretty aggressive schedule in trying to do all this work and get it all tied up by June, no later than June. And today in the conclusions, I've got some preliminary numbers I'm going to share with you. They're very preliminary, so please don't listen. Hopefully they won't be in the Advocate in the morning, but they are my first crack at getting this done. Let me talk some about our historic trends. This chart compares our emissions that are standardized by unit of economic output that we've done in the state. You can see that even dating back to the 1990s, both the US and Louisiana have kind of improved our overall carbon emissions relative to our economic output. Louisiana fell behind a little bit throughout the 1990s up to about 2000, caught up a little bit off now, but in both instances, you've seen reductions of around 60% relative to those 1990 levels. So some big improvement at both levels to think about. For us in the state, because particularly on the combustion of fossil fuels, we use a lot of natural gas here relative to other states. The emissions or the CO2 equivalent per heat unit of fuel that we're burning in the state is relatively low based on the national average. But one of the things you can see in this trend is that differential starting to close a little bit, and a lot of this has to do at the national level with the retirement of coal plants that have occurred throughout the United States. A very aggressive retirement. Somewhere around 30 to 50,000 megawatts of retirements over the last couple of years alone, and a quick phasing out of those resources being replaced by natural gas as well as renewable energy. Our emissions have been down, have peaked up a little bit over the last several years as a share of the U.S. total, somewhere around 5%. A lot of this is, I think, attributable to some of the big increases we've seen in industry over the last several years, and the big expansions that have occurred at many of our chemical facilities. There's a couple of ways of looking at this. One, we've seen those numbers increase because of that. But secondly, if you look at the scale and the scope of a lot of those expansions, the emissions increases are far less than proportional. So from efficiency perspective, at least at the margin, those have not been too deleterious in terms of the share relative to where we stand overall for the United States, which itself is coming down too. One of the things that I think is important that I try to stress with a lot of people is that the share of our emissions and the nature of our emissions differ than the United States overall and a lot of other states. And that primarily is due to the fact that we have a very large share of our emissions that are tied to industrial output. And so if you look at those trends, again, they were somewhat down in the early 2000s, started to pick up in 08, 09, 10, when we started to get what we commonly refer to as the industrial renaissance, when the chemical plant expansions were occurring. We had about 65, 75 billion in new plant additions during this time period. And so we saw some proportional increases with those industrial emissions during that time period as well. You look down at some of the smaller categories relative to industry. The next big one on the block is going to be transportation, followed by power generation. And even on the power gen side, as I mentioned, and I've got more detailed analysis in the December presentation that I gave, we've seen some pretty big improvements in the thermal efficiencies of our generators dating back to about 2010, 2011. A lot of this having to do with the repowering and efficiency improvements at some big natural gas generators in the state where we phased them out from what were primarily steam technologies to combined cycle facilities that are much more efficient than the older steam units that were built in the 50s and the 60s. Again, if you start breaking out these pies, this is Louisiana on the right, this is the US average on the left based on 2018. The big green Pac-Man here is industry, and that accounts for about 66% of our emissions, followed by power, which is around 13. Right. So you look at those two, you're looking at, close to 80% of the emissions across the state concentrated in those two big areas and across those two big actors. Compare that with the United States overall, where power is at 35% of overall. At one time, it was somewhere around 45% and was actually above transportation. Now, transportation related emissions are actually bigger than electric power. And you can see industry at around 17%. So a really big difference in the composition of the two pies and the compositions of our emissions in the state. And those are things that we have and we will continue to tease out of the data when we're looking at the greenhouse gas inventory, particularly as we move forward from this point on and we try to get more granularity in terms of where these emissions are coming from. At potentially the individual facility level, or at least at minimum at the sector level within the chemical and the refining industry. Let me go back and kind of refresh everybody if you're not familiar with what the 2010 study that we did. This was something that was funded primarily by the Department of Economic Development during this time period. This was a little bit after 2008 when the Waxman-Markey bills had been proposed, where there was a lot of national interest in moving with various different national climate change policies. None of them ever came close to fruition. Well, they came close to fruition at the time. In fact, close enough to where the state wanted to see what was going to happen in terms of where our inventory would be and what the impacts were. And so our 2010 study was a pretty big study. Not only did it include the greenhouse gas inventory, but it also took into account a variety of other things in terms of how it impacted our economy, how various different regulatory schemes would impact certain industries in our state. And we did some policy surveys and simulations during that time period, not simulations, but surveys during that time period as well in the study. We used, like a lot of states do, and like we're going to use in this current study, the state inventory tool, which is something that's developed by the Environmental Protection Agency in order to use a standardized approach across all economic sectors. Everything is put in a CO2 equivalent basis, but all greenhouse gases, including methane, are included in the inventory and the analysis. We used 2005 at the time as the base year because that was a year that was being used in a lot of federal proposed legislation. But you'll see as I talk about the current time period, we're doing this on a year-to-year basis and rolling it all the way up from 2000 to 2018. So we'll have annual numbers for each and every year that we can talk about. The tool makes it great. In addition to its transparency and its ability to be replicated, is the fact that it used publicly available information. And we used a lot of that, supplemented it with some state level resources. And we also had a project advisory team back when we did this, formerly, much like the Science Advisory Committee here. However, it was a little bit different. It was really more of a state. It had included not only academics, but also a variety of stakeholders, including NGOs and other industry participants and DEQ and other players that were impacted in executive agencies that advised us on that project as well back then. The study, like the one that we'll be talking about today that we're going to update, had state level emissions, source specific, sector specific, a lot of different ways to cut this information. And that's the power of this tool as well, is it can allow us to go back and forth. And I'll as I go through some of the tabs and give you some examples, it'll become a little bit more apparent to you on its usefulness. In each of the subsections in the report that we did before, we had an overview. We kind of looked at historic emissions, looked at the overall data and provided the results. And what we're going to be doing in this study will be very comparable in terms of that layout as well. The results overall, these are the different modules based on the 2010 study for 2005. And we were somewhere around 214 net out of the sinks, 227 million metric tons gross. And again, as you can see, looking across a lot of different greenhouse gas emission types, not only CO2, but methane and nitrous oxide as well in some of these mobile and stationary applications. Dadgummit, stop doing that. So let's talk about the greenhouse gas inventory for 2020. Like the other one, we're going to be relying on the state inventory tool for a lot of apparent reasons because it's replicatable. And to the extent that we need to use this as a state for something else, for some kind of filing or some kind of showing in the future, having this and being consistent with how other states do that inventory and that tool is going to be important. We're going to be looking at a lot of the same sources of information we did last time in the sectors. We've got a little bit more within the inventory itself, within the tool itself, a little bit more granularity. There's a few additional sectors here that weren't included in the ones before. And as I'll talk about a little bit later, one of the things that we're hoping to do is to be able to drill this down into our industrial sectors and even in the power generation sector, which I mentioned before is going to wind up grabbing about 80% of the emissions in the state. So if you really have to drill down into sectors that are important in terms of location and types of resource, types of sources that are actually emitting this carbon, those are going to be some of the ones to focus on. Again, the last study didn't try to do that and get into that kind of detail. That's something that we're going to try to do in a lot more detail here. We do have a lot of disaggregated information. The center and in LSU over the last couple of years has been participating and worked on a grant from the National Energy Technology Lab in looking at and conducting a feasibility study for carbon capture and sequestration, primarily because of this large industrial sector and these large industrial sources of emissions. CCUS is not an application that's going to be widely used around the world or the United States overall. I think the general numbers are around 13 to 15% of the technical potentials to essentially mitigate against carbon emissions. And while that may be a big high level average when you're looking at it nationally and across the world, those can vary pretty considerably based on a regional level. And in our region in the Gulf Coast, that's probably going to be a very low number relative to the technical capabilities in the large volumes, particularly given the fact that as you look in this pie chart, you've got such a high concentration of emissions that are dedicated to our chemical industries here in the state, as well as our refineries. And you take those two together, that's probably going to account for 80+ % of all the manufacturing and industrial emissions in the state. So again, industry is a big piece, and within industry, chemicals and refining are going to be the biggest pieces, and that should come as no real big surprise to anybody. The emissions are relatively stable. Again, so these are numbers that we did from a source level, and the team that worked on this, both on the subsurface stuff and the engineering stuff, as well as the surface and the source information that we were doing. This all comes from individual plant facility data that we've rolled up and categorized. And again, you can see over time, these two shares in the purples, the light and the dark, are refining and chemicals. They both maintain a pretty consistent trend of emissions throughout the time period that we're looking at. And we, again, like I said before, break this down to the individual facility level. And so you can see essentially not only the industry in the facility level, but also by the type of emissions, that carbon emissions that are being released, not only from the stationary combustion process, but from power generation as well as other processes. Some of these, you got to be a little careful with some of the numbers. The bottom line numbers are always pretty accurate because they have to be. But I've often found that, you got to be a little bit careful in watching through how the allocation happens, particularly on the power side. A lot of that gets picked up in stationary combustion. So it's something to think about when you go through this data. But again, no surprise who those top sources are in the state and their contributions overall to our emissions. So that's going to be a big focus of what we have been doing and what we'll continue to do, particularly as we get down into the weeds of more detail after we get this first high level pass done from the state inventory tool. We're going to be looking at the ag sector and all the methane related releases that do occur through the natural biogenic processes that you're going to find in agriculture. So that's something that we'll do. We're also going to be looking at land use and forestry, and we'll be, working with Melissa and her group and everybody else and Camille that are trying to develop these sink opportunities for the state, particularly with the blue carbon and other things that we'll look into and incorporate in the study as well, which will be happening after we get through kind of this third month break point where we're getting our preliminary data done. Waste management, it's much like the ag side, you're going to have methane releases there that are going to need to be quantified from the facilities themselves, as well as any flaring that happens, and then netting out any landfill gas that's recovered from that, as well as any combustion of municipal solid waste that may be happening on the power generation side. So where do we stand? So that's a background of kind of what we're doing. In many ways, very similar to what we've done in the past. Where are we right now? Well, the state inventory tool has been compiled and we've got preliminary estimates. And I'm going to talk about those at the very end of the presentation and give you a big high level table to look at. And we'll talk, before I get in that, I want to talk into kind of how we got there. We've done another separate analysis that we had got funding from the Nature Conservancy that has generator specific emissions. So we can overlay that with the updates on our industrial individual source emissions to get a lot of resolution on about 80% of the emissions that come from the state, whether they be from a power plant or from an industrial facility. So I think it's going to be a big improvement and something that we'll have that you don't see at a lot of other places, primarily because they probably don't have that many that many diverse and different sources that are so large. Probably Texas and a couple other handful of states are in that kind of position, but I think our analysis will allow us to get there. We have what I'm going to do, and I'm going to talk about this again later with the timeline, is we are now taking and doing essentially small PowerPoint reports on each of the modules and the output from those modules, and we're going to make it available to Virginia and Mark to disseminate to the entire group. And we're trying to get that out by April the 5th. I'm going to give you a high level today, but you all should have some papers in your hands pretty soon in terms of looking at where these numbers are and how they pan out by each sector that we've got. So having said that, let's talk a little bit. I'll give you a feel for kind of how some of these numbers work and how they're calculated. I'm going to start with fossil fuel combustion, because if you'll go back and kind of look at the numbers that we estimated before in the old inventory, that's a really big chunk of those, of the 227 million metric tons. Over 190 of that is going to wind up being in the combustion of fossil fuels, which again should come as no real big surprise. These arise from essentially burning coal, natural gas, liquid fuels, pretty ubiquitous across each of our economic sectors, whether it's residential, commercial, transportation, electric power, or industry. The industrial sector, though, as I mentioned before, is a big determinant of those emissions here in our state, followed by transportation and to a lesser extent electric power, which are kind of neck and neck in terms of shares from the combustion of fossil fuels. The basic math in all of this is essentially determine these emissions based on the fuel consumption, or the fossil fuel consumption in billion BTUs, times an emission factor, which is essentially the ratio of the carbon per MMBTU or BTU of energy that's consumed, converting it into tons, and then converting it into metric tons. And grossing it up for the full molecule, because it's in carbon equivalent alone, to ramp it up to carbon dioxide equivalent alone, to get the overall emissions level for each and every sector. And that's how the basic math works. The one difference is going to be in the industrial sector, and that's particularly important here. And I'm going to show you a tab on the calculation on this in just a little bit. But you also have to take into account the non-energy related consumption to appropriately account for how that energy is used. Not all of that is combusted. Our chemical industry, as many of you probably appreciate, use fossil fuels and derivatives from fossil fuels, much like a baker uses flour to make a variety of different products. And so you need to account for those feedstock uses in the calculation of the inventory. And that's the one big adjustment that has to be made on the industrial side in order to get that number teased out. So to give you a kind of a feel, this is for 2 years, for 17 and 18. This is just for the residential sector alone. We've got our fuel types over here on the left: coal, distillates, kerosene, other NGLs and LPGs, and natural gas. You can see at the residential sector, most of that fossil combustion usage and combustion is going to be in retail natural gas use. So this is going to be what you use as a household for space heating, for water heating, for appliance use, and other things. You've got your emissions factor, your combustion efficiency, and you're just simply rolling through the arithmetic of all this, calculating emissions and grossing that up for the carbon equivalent. So this is for 1 year. We'll do this for every year. You kind of scale this all the way back to the start year, which is 2000 for us, and kind of work it through each year. You sum all that up, and that'll give you the residential one. And you do this for each and every sector within this particular module. This will give you an idea of, it gets a little bit more complicated when you start getting into industry. A much more diverse set of fossil fuels that are used, and derivatives that have their own unique emissions factors. whether it's asphalt and road oil that goes in as inputs, crude oil and distillates, which will go in, various different feedstocks, still gas, which will be captured. You can see those getting captured more and more in the near end of the time trend. And we're LPGs here, which are important feedstocks. So this will be your total consumption in billion BTUs. Here's where we go in and account for that in terms of feedstock uses. So of the 625 billion BTUs, 625,000 billion BTUs of LPGs, a big chunk of that is going to be used for feedstocks, which again is no big surprise in the chemical industry when you look at those kinds of numbers. Even the things that are defined as feedstocks are going to be pretty high percentages. And for us, here's the big headline number for a lot of our industries, and that is the huge amounts of natural gas they use. So for this is going to be somewhere around 1.3 trillion cubic feet. Just for 2018 alone for industrial uses. And again, working that math out through the emissions factors, the combustion efficiencies to get in a number in short tons, converting it to metric tons, and then moving it out to the CO2 equivalent. So again, that's what this comes from. If you're wondering, well, how do you go through all this stuff? Well, you can do survey-based methods and other things that we've used in the past, but EPA has got a table where they've gone in and calculated those shares. I've broken the table up so that you can get a feel for kind of where this is not a constant over time. It does vary. So if you look at the shares in the 1990s, they're pretty close, but they do change. So I've got, from 90 to 94, and then we jump to 2014 and look at some of the more contemporaneous numbers. And you can see some bouncing around on some of them on a year-to-year basis, which is good to see that there's some variation in this. See the big pickup, for instance, in certain types of feedstocks that are preferenced more today than they were in the past. Where's the other thing? Still gas in particular, you see those shares pick up as emission requirements today are different than they were in the early 1990s. So a lot of that being captured and used and reused as a feedstock in refinery operations. So that gives you an idea on just the headline numbers on combustion. You go through all those different sectors. I just pulled out a couple of things to give you a flavor for some of the calculations. You've got to do this for each and every sector across each and every fuel type for each and every year. Electricity consumption, another thing that is an interesting example. I'll provide that to you. Obviously, we all use electricity for a variety of different things, and our economy is becoming much more digitized, and those power requirements are changing on a year in and year out basis. However, we use a lot of fossil fuels to generate electricity. We use I would say a relatively cleaner slate of those in Louisiana than in other states, but we still do use quite a bit of natural gas relative to the national averages even here. So if you have a higher share of coal, your emission factor that you use for calculating electricity related emissions is going to be higher than if you don't. Ours is kind of a little to the lower than average side, and those emission factors come from EPA's eGrid database, which again takes the average fuel efficiency across the portfolio of resources in your state and figures that out. These are used in the acid rain database. They're used for regulatory purposes. So this is a good source of information for understanding what goes on in the power sector. The math is real similar to what I talked about before. You need to figure out electricity consumption and factor out the losses times an emissions factor. And you take those and you sum them across all the different sectors to figure out the total amount associated with electricity consumption. So to get a feel for what this looks like mathematically, here's a little tab. We start off here with I'm sorry for the small print, somewhere around 21.4 to 21.5 million megawatt hours. I know what the big number is here. I don't know what the disaggregate number is. EIA has an appliance saturation survey they do. I think it's once every 2 to 5 years. I've forgotten exactly. So you can go in and disaggregate or proportion that based on average appliance saturation. So if you assume 10% of this activity is in space heating, you can whack that out. Why is that going to be useful for us later if you're starting to look at things or policies where you want to promote a lot of in-use energy efficiency at the end-use level, at the retail level? Well, this will give us an idea to go in and say, well, what if we change building code standards in Louisiana and we want to raise the HVAC efficiencies and the average compressor efficiencies for air conditioners in the state by a fixed SEER factor? You could go back in and recalculate that, and you can run through all the math and figure out where those emissions are coming from, not only based on the total sector, which is residential, but some of these high-level electricity uses as well. And you can take this number because all power systems are based on, a balancing of supply and demand, and ramp them back to see how that impacts overall the feedback effects on emission factors, to ramp down the higher, less efficient units, to bring the more efficient units online that can tend to have better heat rates and thermal efficiencies, which can tend to have better emission factors as well, and how that kind of feeds back in the system. So that'll, setting it up this way will give you that kind of flexibility and ability to do that. Again, another similar sector. This is in 1990, 91. We keep scroll down the years. If I had the actual spreadsheet in front of me, about 15 million megawatt hours in commercial use in 1990 in Louisiana. We could use, again, that's appliance saturation survey to prorate out the megawatt hours and to roll that through and to get the emissions that are implied by all of that as well. Excuse me. So that was a little taste. I ran through a lot of this pretty fast. What's the bottom line number and all this? So right now we've gotten through most all the modules. We're still doing some more tinkering around. I'm not quite done, but we're close to being done. We're going to have something, as I mentioned, next week, right after the holiday, that we're going to get out to the scientific advisory group to start providing some input. You can see the sectors from the 2005 study. We've got a few more here that we're using now. I've got some reconciliation that I'm trying to get through in my mind on this, because there seems to be some double counting, and I got to figure out a way of dealing with this. For instance, you've got 37 million metric tons in electricity consumption, but I know there's a comparable level up here in the power generation piece of the fossil fuels. Seems like to me some of those might be getting double counted, so I need to think about how that works. But right now, just based on our preliminary numbers, and I feel pretty good about this. This number is the headline number, and I feel very good about that module and what we've done. We're somewhere around 240, so the new estimate somewhere around 240 million metric tons. You compare that to where we were in 05 at 227 million. I think we're up a little over 10%, around 10% or so. Over a 13, 15 year period, a little less than 1% a year in terms of those increases. So, I guess there's good and bad in that. The rate of increase is certainly slowed down, but we're still at a higher level than we were, obviously, and that probably comes as no surprise relative to the last study. But what we'll wind up doing is having a different file for review that are in each and every one of these sectors and / modules, and kind of let everybody tear at it, make suggestions, look at what the results are, question it, ask questions. I think one of the things that are going to be most important, in addition to just a critique of all this, is to offer suggestions on what people would like to see in detail from this, recognizing that we're not going to be answering solutions. We're just counting the X's and O's, but what are the formats? What are some of the things that would be helpful for people as we move forward, because ultimately this is going to inform policy. So what's the format and the framework that you would like to see some of these numbers and the detail that may be in these, if you're missing it. And when you get into each of these files, you'll be able to get a feel and appreciation for how much detail is in each and every one. So they all stand alone and can provide you with that kind of input. We can also talk about those. I'll be open. Anybody wants to call or email, we can do that as well. In terms of our milestones, so we're at about 3 months right now. We've been talking back and forth with the governor's office and some of the members of it, with Mark and Virginia in particular. This is our first kind of big rollout on the preliminary number. We're going to try to get it all out to you, as I mentioned, right after the holiday. While you are doing that, I'm going to be focusing on trying to get to more granularity and detail, as well as going back and checking some of these preliminary numbers to make sure everything's on apples and oranges, it's syncing up, we're not double counting, those kinds of things. We're looking at getting another preliminary version before we finalize in 5 months, and then having that final version in 6 months, which would be in June relative to when we started at the beginning of the year. And so those are the goals. Lindsay, I guess we have a little time for questions. Hopefully I didn't eat up too much of everybody's time. I went a little longer than I thought, but I'm happy to answer any question anybody's got if you want to fire them off. And per one of the chat notes earlier, we will be making this available. I think Lindsay's going to get it around to everybody.
Hey, David. Excellent presentation as always. I got a question. As I'm trying to dig through the methodology for Louisiana, we're kind of unique with such a high industry output. When you count industry is a big user of electrical power.
Right.
So they're a big customer of the power companies.
Right.
And they have in-plant power production. if I am reviewing the industry's CO2 equivalents, is the power used by an industry, I won't name it, I guess it wouldn't be, it'd be tacky to name a company, but if I look at a facility and I look at the CO2 equivalents that you're attributing to that facility, is that accounting for the power they may be buying from their provider?
Yeah, it takes into account a couple of things, but they're in different places in the framework of the model. So you're going to have their combustion of stuff. They're going to have your process combustion done up in the combustion of fossil fuels. So your boilers, your steam units, all those kinds of things, process uses, those will all be up in the combustion part. The power part will be in the, I showed you a residential and a commercial tab. There's an industrial one that's in there too. And then in addition to that, on the power generation side, to match it on the other side, on getting the emissions factor, any on-site generation that's at these industrial facilities. And keep in mind that we have one of the highest shares of on-site industrial power generation in the United States at 23% of our total capacity. You got to account for those as well, and those are in there. And that's a little bit of a benefit relative to most power generation emission factor numbers, because as you know, Mark, those facilities are have such a high thermal efficiency rating on when they're capturing energy, et cetera, that you're going to drive down the heat rates on that to be relatively low. So you figure a standalone utility generator is going to be, for a combined cycle plant, it's going to be somewhere around 7,000-8,000 heat rate, 6,000-8,000. One of these cogen units are going to be 5,000-6,000. So its emissions are going to be proportional. So we get a benefit. So you're counting for all of that in each of those places.
So is there not a possibility you're double counting it?
There is. See, that's what's throwing me is the last time when we did the study, we didn't have this module, and now they've got it. And I was going back through some of the documentation, and you're not going to believe this, but they essentially said something like, well, this might be double counting, but that's not so bad as long as we're trying to reduce carbon emissions or something like that. I'm like, well, wait a minute.
Yeah, but if you're Louisiana with huge industrial customers, and I'm a refinery next to New Orleans, Entergy is being credited for CO2 production, and then my facility is being credited for the same CO2 because of my power usage, and I'm double counting significant amounts of CO2 potentially. Yeah,
you are. And so we're going to go back in and make sure that that's one of my big ticket things that we've got to work for on that. I don't think it's that bad, but right now, the way it stands, I think it is counting them twice, actually.
Oh, David,
let me say one thing about this, though, Mark, and that is, even having gone through that exercise with that tool, that's still going to be, I think, useful, even if it doesn't go additively into the calculation, because that detail that I showed you about before, if we want to get into in-use efficiencies, that gives you that link to get in there to find out, well, if we were to go in and have various different programs, and we're doing that in the state right now, our state regulators are looking at these efficiency programs. They have a couple of them on the books right now with Entergy and CLECO and SWEPCO. You know, if we were to double down on that, on in-use efficiency on the power side, how would that ripple through? Even if we back that out, that module helps us tell that story and tell how that creates a benefit.
Well, if I'm LCA and my membership has worked really hard to reduce 30% of emissions, but then I'm getting double counted because I'm buying power from Entergy, it kind of disincentivizes me. That's a little, and I know it's nothing you can do, but I think as you get into granularity, that's something, because I think it could be a significant number.
Oh, it's going to be, yeah, I think you're double counting to the tune. If right now you look at it, somewhere around 30 million metric tons potentially. That's a big deal, right? So out of 200 something, and that might be bringing our, if you pull that out and bring that down and do a couple other things, that brings us almost to parity with where we were before in 2005.
Yeah. Eric, did you have a question?
Yeah, well, just a quick comment on what you all were talking about. If the base data that you're using is still the EPA inventory, the inventory actually breaks out process CO2 from combustion CO2. So you may be able to back calculate the degree of double counting using the EPA's data itself.
Yeah, I found though that some of that stuff you got to be careful with, though. It's not all that accurate. I hate to say that. I think it's accurate in how it's reported at a total facility level, but how it gets allocated across, I have questions about. Case in point, I know for a fact where these guys have cogen facilities, and yet you go down that column and you look for electricity, and there's nothing showing up for cogen, right? Well, I know you got a power plant there. Why aren't you reporting the numbers? I'm not saying that the top line number is wrong. It may be embedded in stationary combustion, but you don't see it popping up other places. And it may be that they're not measuring it there. I don't know what's going on with that. But when we did the study for carbon capture, I noticed that popping up in some of the data as well. And it's important when you think about carbon capture because the carbon coming off of those different processes has different quality, and so it has different implications. You're not going to want to do carbon capture behind a power plant, but you would with, ammonia production, for instance.
Exactly. Well, I think that's just one of our fallback positions might be to just go back and reconstruct the allocation process and apply our own standard, but using EPA numbers as a starting point.
Yeah, and I hear you, and I think that's something we're thinking and talking about. But one of the things, and Mark made this point last time he and I met about it, that's it's going to be important that we at least have one set of numbers that follows the cookbook.
Absolutely.
Have that, and then we can go back.
I had one other quick question because it wasn't mentioned, but I noticed in the EPA data, they tend to have fixed multiples to calculate methane emissions and nitrous oxide emissions. It's the same for every plant. It's like 10% for one and 20% for the other. Have they improved the process for measuring those two, or would you be using the same algorithm they currently use?
Yeah, we would be using the same algorithm. I'd have to go back on some of the on the stationary sources where they do the nitrous oxide and the methane to see if those vary over time. I'm actually meant to do that and didn't. Because I think they do vary over time. So there is some variation in them and they do update them. I'd have to go back and see how much it changes though. Actually, it's got to, because there've been a lot of improvements in some of our performance I was looking at it the other day on the stationary, on the methane releases for some of the stationary sources.
Well, I think, particularly from some of the stuff we've talked about in the past, my little pet project is to focus on the process CO2 because it's a higher quality CO2 and I have a better chance of making something out of it.
Right.
Combustion CO2.
I agree. It's not all CO2 is the same. And that's another thing that I think we'll have at the end of the day for the broader task force, because I think this is going to be an important issue that needs to get discussed in strategies. And you're right, Eric, that's something that has to be teased out.
Yeah, David, great. If I can ask a question, great work. It's a lot in there. Thanks for doing this. I've got a few questions. I guess my start is, what about things like leaks? Leaks from pipelines, leaks from abandoned wells. How does that get factored in there?
So I'll get back with you and tell you in more specificity, but I do think in terms of the emission factors, those are calculated in the data for the oil and gas systems. I do recall years ago when I was looking at it, I know they go in and calculate it by, they make certain assumptions in each state based off the PHMSA data on pipelines based on material composition. And so with us, it's not such a bad thing because we've got a lot of protected steel in the state and large systems that get replaced a lot. But if you get into these LDC systems in the mid-Atlantic and New England, where they've got a lot of cast iron and bare steel, those leak rates for methane are going to be higher, and it gets factored into that emissions factor. And the same thing goes with the wells. I'm knock on wood. There's a factor included in there for methane releases at the wellhead. They're done based on the downside on all these is that they're done on an average basis, a national average basis. So whatever a well is whatever a well is whatever a well is, whatever unprotected steel is whatever unprotected steel is, and you're assuming certain age and vintage associated with the asset.
So it's like what Eric said, where it's just some coefficient.
Yes.
And it's a guesstimate.
Yeah, but it is included, and as you can imagine, it's very important to include that because it's methane coming out of most of those pipes.
Also, have you had any experience comparing these kinds of numbers to what you might get from, there are some emerging satellites, there's the GHG-SAT and some other emerging remote sensing tools. Any thoughts on how these compare to?
I have not. I think people have done that. I have not done it, and we have talked about it early on in this process, and I think it may be something that we look at. I heard a rumor that we might get some of that kind of data for Louisiana, and it would certainly be worth looking and comparing to.
Okay, thanks.
I will say this though, we will have probably the next best thing when it comes to the industrial stuff, because we can take it down to the plant level, and I think those emissions are pretty accurate at the plant level in total. At least there may be some variation on what source they're coming from within the fence line, but they're pretty accurate at the individual plant level.
KT, you look like you were
definitely at the power plant level.
Well, David, as usual, great, excellent presentation, and nice to see you again after a long time. I have a question. This may not be a part of your overall work product here, but I do have to ask you this question because to all extents, even if we have the best inventory for Louisiana and we come to a certain situation where we know that we can reach carbon neutrality by 2050. But if our neighboring states don't have an equivalent plan or even close to it, a kind of a scenario analysis should be made to say that, yes, we probably will reach this, but it will not be realistic. Is there any possibility that you will be doing anything of that sort, or can we impose on you?
I do know that, and I think we're going to talk about it later. I assume that's going to be taken into account in this pathways model at some point as one of the scenarios. I mean, you're right. If you do things like this, I mean, it would be unique. That's one of the challenges for us in the state is we operate and live in a part of the world that's not like everywhere else. And I don't mean that by saying the obvious, but you look up in the Northeast where you've got RGGI or the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, and you've got states that are, participating next to one another and compete with one another. It's different than down here on the Gulf Coast. So if we do something and Texas doesn't, and you got a refinery in Baytown, you got one in Baton Rouge, Bayer is down in Luling and they've got facilities, in Baytown as well. What do you do? Right.
That's a concern for me, even with the overall recommendations of the task force. That would be something that we have to be careful about.
Yep.
Yeah. Atmosphere doesn't know state boundaries.
Yes, that's right.
but it's a global issue, and it's CO2 in a way is different from something. Certainly it may co-occur with toxic gases, but we're concerned about our emissions to a gas and its global concentration. And so everything, and so it's a little bit different, let's say, from an acid rain story where Texas may put out acid rain and a chemical going in acid rain, and it would land on Louisiana. Here we're talking about chemicals that go in the entire world. So I think that our neighboring states are obviously a concern in terms of the global picture, but I'm a little bit less concerned about what our neighboring states are doing in terms of the way we calculate the CO2 budget.
Well, I'm more worried about the economic impacts eventually. And if you haven't noticed, there's a very recent, just released National Academy report on accelerating decarbonization of the U.S. energy system. It just came out last week. Talks about this.
Well, guys, we're excellent conversation, and I'd love to jump in the middle of it and continue this, but we have a time schedule to keep. And do we have any direct, and I don't mean to cut anybody off, but I do know we have a pretty tight schedule. Do we have any other direct questions to ask of David? And again, I apologize if you feel like I'm shutting you off. It's just I want to grab David while we're lucky enough to have him on the Zoom call.
Yes, I do. I have a direct question. I'm a little bit new to these tools, and I'm having trouble finding what the documentation is for the protocols. And I see lots of different options, and I'm just wondering which ones you found most useful in understanding exactly how everything's calculated.
If you want there's some good users manuals for each module that are on the same page that you can download the modules themselves on.
No, but those just tell you, click in the green box and put your number. But what I mean is all the stuff like how are they counting for double counting and things like that? And what are sort of the theoretical protocols that they're following?
Oh, I have to go back and get the metadata and the documentation on that. I've forgotten where that actually is right now. I have to go back and pull that.
Well, the website tells us that it's the same protocol as was followed for the U.S. greenhouse gas inventory. That's it's on a separate page. Oh, it's okay. You don't have a direct answer, then that's all right.
I will look it up.
Richard,
I will look it up and get it to you. I've read it before. I haven't for this particular one, but I did for the last time, and I'll go find the documentation on it.
Yeah.
Yeah,
We'll
David,
provide
that would be very
UC.
helpful, because I guess what Richard you're asking about is, as I perform a review, to understand some of the where
Yeah.
the numbers are coming from and how they're being used. So if you can find anything, look to Virginia. I'm sorry, I think I interrupted you.
Oh, no, I was just going to ask David if he would send that to us, and we'll be sure the rest of the committee advisory group gets it. And Mark, do you want to tell them real quickly what your plan is for, say we get this all on April the 5th, what our strategy is for pulling in the experts on the committee?
Sure, and this is still very much in draft form, so we'll throw it out to, y'all can email comments and thoughts. Basically, what we're proposing is to take total SAG and split us up into subgroups, and each subgroup will be assigned based on your expertise and your interests to review different aspects of the LSU report, David's report. And so we've been looking. So what you'll do is you'll do a deep dive in your area that your subgroups assigned. There'll be a chairperson assigned to kind of lead that group, and you'll provide the review on that. Then we'll get together as a collective group, and each subcommittee will report their findings. So we all discuss it as a group, what we saw. But we would also want every member to review the overall report, and kind of like you do an NSF proposal review. Each reviewer is assigned 2 to 3 extensive reviews, and the whole group's supposed to kind of look over all the proposals, and then a champion of a proposal will give their assessment of their deep dive. So we propose something very similar. So without overloading one group, we're thinking of splitting this into different sectors, and the sectors would be transportation, power, industrial, which includes the combustion and non-combustion based buildings, and oil and gas. That's a big one. Agricultural, land-based sinks, and then waste management. That kind of aligns with what David's and EPA's reports are, except we broke out power from we have power broken in, energy broken to transportation and power, because those are pretty substantial review items themselves, and that would allow our expertise to align well with it. So that's how we're planning on doing it. We'll give each subgroup some time to go into the deep dive, and then we'll come together, and each chairperson or subgroup will give their assessment, and then we'll all discuss as a group, and then that's kind of how we'll move this review along.
Okay.
David, what do you think of that? I mean, you're the author of this.
I think it's perfect. I think it lines up well, and it lines up by very important functional categories, and it'll fit well in terms of what we're sending you.
Okay, and we'll send the document out for everybody to look at and provide any comments, and then we'll try to start making up the subgroups, and then we'll make a stab at it, and you could say, I'd rather be on this one or not for this reason. But we're going to try to utilize your expertise. And when we put together I know Lindsay and them and Harry put together the SAG, the idea was to have a cross-section of expertise so we can do these kind of reviews. So hopefully we'll be able to put somebody in an area that have expertise and they're interested. Virginia, you have any additional comments, or David or Lindsay?
No, I think if everyone's ready, just knowing what's coming, and we may not need a full SAG meeting to actually partition out these various topics that'll be in the inventory or sections. And so we'll be sharing with you that material directly. And David, any follow-up materials that you want to share with the SAG, and Camille's already done part of that in the chat. So I think we probably should move ahead unless someone objects to the next topic.
Thank you, David.
Thank you, David. This is great knowing what's coming, and I like the comment that you had about there being more granularity in this updated inventory than you had from the first two that you had done for the state. And that leads to this being able the industry breakout that he's putting a great deal of focus on, because that is we're unique in that regard, and that is our #1 contribution to the greenhouse gas emissions and to the atmosphere. Very unique for Louisiana, but we also have some unique sink opportunities. And this next section of our agenda, we're going to talk about emission sinks and potential inputs into the inventory, and as we calculate the impacts of the solutions that will be proposed in the state action plan. So just a little bit of context here. Eric Calavota, who is the Deputy Secretary of DOT, reached out to us and asked if we could help calculate the net carbon sequestration impact of using rights of ways along highway corridors and offsets that the transportation sector might get through what he called derelict lands or abandoned lands and afforestation efforts on those properties. And so we pulled together a small team, Alex Kolker on the call here, Barry Kime, Camille Stagg, and we met with Eric about what he was looking for specifically. And then we brought in a member of the Land Use, Buildings and Housings Committee, Zia Ning, Dr. Ning from Southern, and looking at forest and their effects on cooling in buildings and that sort of thing. That's her area of expertise. And we also brought in Joy Bro and Buck Vandersteen, who are on the Agriculture, Forestry, Conservation and Waste Committee. And so we've been looking and kind of made some assignments, and the folks on the phone here today or on the Zoom here today have already done some legwork to try to look more specifically, not using some national coefficient number for Louisiana forest or wetlands. We should have the best data that we can have for accuracy. So we had this small group, and we kind of stood down for a little bit to see what was going to come out of the inventory and learn more about the SIT tool. And it does have a process for assessing carbon sequestration in forest, but it does not, as I say, have a whole lot of material on wetlands. So we have that expertise here in Louisiana. We have Melissa Bastian with the Water Institute and Camille Stagg at USGS, and a host of others that work with these folks to come up with estimates of the carbon sequestration capacity in Louisiana's extensive wetlands. So we've asked, and hopefully this can all be used to refine and as inputs to the greenhouse gas inventory that David is working on, and to track our efforts and our successes in the future here. So Melissa, if you and Camille are ready, they're going to present about their blue carbon work. And blue carbon, I don't mean ocean carbon. That's the term they use for coastal carbon, coastal habitat carbon, and quantifying carbon in natural wetlands throughout Louisiana. So if we can turn it over to them at this point, that would be good.
Yes,
Melissa?
thank you. Can you guys all hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay, great. And so I'm going to talk about estimating carbon in Louisiana's natural lands today. I'm Melissa Bastian. I'm a coastal ecologist with the Water Institute of the Gulf. I'm also the director of the Restore X Center of Excellence for Louisiana. I'd like to thank my colleague, Dr. Camille Stagg, for helping me put together these slides today and for advising me on some of these carbon sink slides that I'll present later, and some of the great resources that USGS has to offer. So many of you know Governor John Bell Edwards has this vision for Louisiana to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions, to do its part to limit the worst impacts of climate change and improve the welfare of its residents and environment while maintaining its position as a world leader in energy, industry, agriculture, forestry, and transportation. And many of you also know that these greenhouse gas reduction goals there's 3 of them, one by year 2025, one by year 2030, and to be net zero by year 2050. So to help reach some of these goals, there will be solutions or strategies that will rely on carbon capture. And I wanted to define carbon capture here today because we tend to use these terms and they can mean various different things, right? And so how I think about this is there's industrial processes. For example, David Dismukes just talked about the CCUS, carbon capture, utilization, and storage. And it's the process of capturing waste carbon dioxide that can be stored in geological formations. And it can occur at coal-fired power plants, cement factories, etc. So here's an image of just how that CO2 might be transported and stored in these geologic formations. Well, carbon capture to ecologists can mean carbon fixation or photosynthesis by plants. And it's driven by plants or algae and cyanobacteria. And this carbon is stored in their biomass of those organisms, but also then it gets later buried in sediment and soils of natural lands. And so, as many of you have seen from this Princeton Net Zero America report or the US Climate Alliance, and by using these greenhouse gas reduction pathways, natural lands are being mentioned as pillars to support the transition to net zero. So for example, number 6 here says enhance land sinks. And then in here, the US Climate Alliance suggests maintaining natural and working lands because they're very important for capturing carbon and storing it. So there's lots of carbon terminology, and I've already started talking about some of it, right? And so just to make sure we're all on the same page, carbon capture, like I mentioned, in natural systems and natural lands is the process of grabbing CO2, and it's done by photosynthetic organisms. And so here's a picture of wetland plants, or maybe you think of pine forest. And then accumulation is the amount of carbon that is gained over time. And a lot of times we measure that in the soil. So soil carbon accumulation rates. And then storage of that carbon is the long-term preservation in the soils. And so this is what happens once the carbon is buried in the soils and it gets stored away. So we also tend to use the term sequestration. It can mean various things, but in the literature, I found that it can be defined as capturing and storing the atmospheric CO2. So I put a diagram here showing the capturing process and storing is what sequestration is. We also have heard the term sinks and sources. And so these natural lands tend to be sinks because they are storing more carbon than they release. And then there's other sources, which are reservoirs that are releasing more carbon than they store. And so these are really common terms that we find in this discussion about carbon. And so we also tend to think about carbon in our natural lands as either green carbon or blue carbon. And so I want to spend some time talking about, well, what is green carbon or what is blue carbon? And so generally we think of green carbon as the carbon that's captured and stored in terrestrial ecosystems by plants. And green carbon is found in terrestrial ecosystems like forests and shrublands, grasslands, and agricultural lands. And they store organic carbon in above ground biomass, so the stems and leaves, or below ground biomass, so the roots and rhizomes, and in the soils. Blue carbon tends to be captured in coastal habitats by aquatic and wetland plants. It is found in coastal habitats like tidal forests, like our swamps, marshes, submerged aquatic vegetation, and seagrasses. And it stores organic carbon in flooded soils as long-term sinks. And this is really important because once these soils are flooded, it really reduces how much decomposition occurs of that carbon. And Louisiana's coastal habitats are diverse and have great potential of blue carbon. And so you can look at green and blue carbon as these natural land sinks, right? And they tend to capture and store more CO2 than they emit. And so you can break them down into the essential pools that you can find in these habitats, these green and blue carbon areas. So in green or terrestrial systems, you find the carbon in the atmosphere, the biomass, and then the soils. And the major fluxes is those rates of the capture or growth, their mortality, their accumulation, and then the vertical flux, or those gas emissions back to the atmosphere. Very similar to blue carbon habitats, except the blue carbon also has this aquatic or water pool where carbon can be found. And the major carbon fluxes with the blue carbon are similar to terrestrial systems, except they also have that lateral flux where there's an export of dissolved carbon to the aquatic pool. So blue carbon accumulates carbon in the soil and stores it. And coastal wetlands are ideal habitats to store carbon. Again, I mentioned the flooded soils help preserve the carbon, and these coastal wetlands are responding to sea level rise. So they are accumulating carbon to vertically accrete to keep up with sea level rise. And so the soils keep accumulating carbon over time, and they're growing. And to do this, they have this growing soil accommodation space with rising seas. And so this is what this image is showing, that when sea level rise occurs, these wetlands are able to keep up with it by producing more organic matter, storing it in the soils. And that space is called accommodation space. And it's compared to forests, or the green carbon, that tend to get saturated with carbon. These blue carbon habitats tend to keep increasing their carbon accumulation. So blue carbon is essential, and a lot of organizations and studies have mentioned this, including the contribution of wetlands to the national greenhouse gas reductions. And so this was an IPCC report with having the 2013 wetlands supplement. Also, the EPA's National Greenhouse Gas Inventory recognizes this, and a paper out in Nature Climate Change by Crooks et al. 2018 stresses the importance of blue carbon. So how important are Louisiana marsh soils, right? So we have extensive coastal wetlands in our state, and how important are they to capturing carbon? Well, the soil carbon storage in Louisiana is about 4 megatons of CO2 per year. And you can compare this to the Gulf of Mexico, North America, and globally. And so Louisiana's carbon in their marsh soils is about 65% of the capacity of Gulf of Mexico, almost 50% of the capacity of North America, and it ranges between 5 to 21% of the capacity of the world. So Louisiana's extensive marshes, for example, play an important role of producing, capturing, and storing that carbon in the soils. And you can look at it in a different way. You can look at the soil carbon accumulation rate. So this is on the x-axis from 0 to 500. These are common ecological units of grams of carbon per meter squared per year. And then you can look at these various global habitats. And this was these green bars show this great review paper by McLeod et al. 2011. And so they show that some average rates of habitats. And you can see that with Louisiana's diverse coastal Louisiana marshes, that they rival these other habitats, that they are almost near 400 grams of carbon per meter squared per year compared to some of these other habitats. So these soils are accumulating a lot of carbon. But one of the challenges with not protecting our wetlands is that they can, once they start converting to open water and we lose wetlands, they can start becoming a source of CO2. And so they can start releasing carbon dioxide, and they can also release methane. And so there has been estimates of methane emissions from these blue carbon habitats and because of land loss. And here's that paper from Crooks et al. 2018 that discusses what might happen when wetlands turn to open water and what their estimates are for the amount of carbon emissions because of that conversion. And so, like I mentioned, land loss contributes to these carbon emissions. And so here's the infamous red map of Louisiana. This is from 1932 to 2016. The red area shows wetland area lost from 1932 to 1995, and the blue area shows from 1995 to 2016. So because we've been losing a lot of wetlands in Louisiana, we're losing that really important carbon that's stored in the soils. And it turns from a sink, some areas can turn from a sink to a source. So how are we going to quantify the carbon in these natural lands? Well, there are many approaches, and Camille Steg and I put together this table to show 3 that are complementary. And Dr. Dismukes just gave a great presentation that talked about the EPA state inventory tool. And so we put that on here to be able to show what each of these approaches address. So starting, and we call them tiers because as you get greater in the number, you add more details and sophistication to these approaches. So for the tier 1 approach, David Dismukes talked a little bit about this, about how there is some green carbon being accounted for in the inventory. So we made a check mark here. As he mentioned, with this EPA state inventory tool, it depends on default values that the EPA recommends, and that this is really important for a baseline estimate. So this study that's being done in 2020. So there's another approach that I am leading for the Governor's Office of Coastal Activities and the Coastal Protection and Restoration Authority. And for simplicity, we're just calling this the tier 2 approach. And this is going to include blue carbon. This is going to include the coastal zone. It will include some of the default values so we can understand what values have been used by some of these methods, but we're also going to do some literature review on more local values in Louisiana. And that it also will include a baseline estimate of blue carbon in coastal Louisiana, and it will provide some future projected estimates of that coastal carbon. So for years 2025, 2030, and 2050 to align with the governor's goals. Another approach is to work with our colleagues at USGS. And this is can be led by Camille Steg. And this is to include blue carbon and green carbon to use more local values from Louisiana. It will depend on a dynamic carbon stock flow model. It's spatially explicit. It can include the baseline estimate of 2020, and it can include some future projected estimates of 2025, 2030, and 2050. And so we're going to talk a little bit more about these 3 approaches. And so David Dismukes already talked about this tier 1 EPA state inventory tool. This is the SIT tool that he mentioned. And he mentioned how this was conducted in 2010, this greenhouse gas inventory. And so this is the table that he showed earlier that also has this category of land use change and forestry. And you note that for the carbon dioxide gas, that the value is negative 13, showing that it's an important sink, that this land use category is taken up CO2, it's not releasing CO2. And so David Dismukes and his team is updating this greenhouse gas inventory for 2020, as he just mentioned. And so one thing we've noticed about this state inventory tool is that wetlands is currently missing from the state inventory tool. And so one idea is that the EPA recommends that we could use the 2013 IPCC wetland supplement to help with estimating the carbon sink in these coastal wetlands. And we found out from colleagues at the EPA that information can be available for the state inventory tool in April. And so that is an option for us to have with David Dismukes' analyses, is also some supplementary information from the EPA that is expected to come out soon, I guess next month. So, but there still is this need for more specific Louisiana information, and these tier 2 and tier 3 approaches can help. So we're going to discuss a little bit more about these tier 2 and tier 3. So this tier 2 approach, again, is working with the Coastal Protection and Restoration Authority and the Governor's Office of Coastal Activities. And it focuses on blue carbon. The tasks involved with this that I'm leading the team is to conduct the state of the science literature reviews. What do we know about coastal Louisiana's habitats and how much carbon is being captured and accumulated and emitted, for example? We're also planning to host technical meetings with our colleagues to get a peer review of our literature review. We plan to have estimates of the potential carbon captured in these coastal natural lands with and without the 2017 Coastal Master Plan restoration projects, because we're really interested in what happens with restoration. And if you restore these coastal wetlands, how much more carbon could you potentially capture and store? And then we will prepare a final report with future projected estimates for those future years to align with the governor's goals. And so to give you an idea, in case you're not aware, this is the front page of the 2017 Coastal Master Plan. It's called Louisiana's Comprehensive Master Plan for a Sustainable Coast. It's the guiding document of CPRA that uses the best available science and engineering. It focuses its efforts and guides the actions needed to sustain Louisiana's coastal ecosystem, safeguard coastal populations, and protect vital economic and cultural resources. To give you an idea of the type of restoration projects within this master plan is marsh creation projects are about $18 billion out of the $25 billion, as you can see here, of the various restoration projects. So these marsh creation projects, filling in open water to create marsh habitat, again, is a really important way to restore the amount of carbon that can be captured and stored in our coastal zone. And so here's an example of model output from the 2017 Coastal Master Plan. So on the x-axis is year and model run from year 1 to year 49. And this is the area of these habitats to give you an idea. And this is coast-wide. And so the dark green is fresh forested wetlands or swamps, and then fresh marsh in the light green, intermediate marsh in the yellow, brackish marsh in the orange, and salt marsh in the red, and then bare ground in the gray. So this is some of the model output that we plan to use to estimate how much carbon potentially is being captured and stored in our coastal zone. And so the timeline for this project is to have the state of the science reviews completed by July 2021 this year, to have our technical meetings wrapped up by August, to have our first estimate of carbon in these coastal natural lands by October, and then to have our report finished by December. And so the next tier is more details, and another level of sophistication is, we're calling it the tier 3 approach. And this is by our colleagues at USGS. And this is using a land use carbon simulator or Lucas model. And it's a stock flow model that uses landscape simulation. So you can use historical land cover and current land cover. You can also use future scenarios using like sea level rise or restoration to be able to develop that landscape. And then it is coupled with a carbon dynamics model. And so this is what depends on carbon field data. So updated stocks and fluxes so that it can project the ecosystem carbon on the landscape. And so again, this tier 3 approach could be built upon tier 2 from the CPRA GOCA project. It can incorporate outputs from that tier 2 project, including the 2017 Coastal Master Plan model output. And importantly, this is a risk assessment tool that is being developed by USGS. And so here's an example of model output from Sleater et al. 2019 in Global Change Biology. This is an example of model output. So the stock of the carbon here in this panel A with time. So looking at the future projection of the carbon stock. And then this also looks at the net carbon balance of live biomass and also and of the soil. And what is not showing here is other output that can be developed from this model is the emissions to the atmosphere and the emissions or the lateral flux to the water. And so this Lucas model can be expanded to all ecosystems of Louisiana. So it can cover the entire state of Louisiana, including the green or terrestrial carbon and the blue carbon. And this is important because this can provide the only estimate of inland wetlands. Currently, the Tier 1 approach from the EPA does not include wetlands. It can include coastal wetlands, as I mentioned next month with that 2013 IPCC supplement approach. But we still would not have any coverage of those inland wetlands unless we use some type of approach like the Tier 3. And so our next steps and some important questions that we've been discussing with David Dismukes is how will tidal wetlands, that blue carbon, be accounted for in the Louisiana baseline for 2020? And so for that 2020 greenhouse gas inventory that David Dismukes and his team are working on now that he just presented to us, it does not include coastal wetlands, but it can if we get that information from the EPA next month in April. We can also get this information from the Tier 2 approach that I just discussed, and the Tier 3 approach with USGS could also provide this. So we do have some options for this. Well, how will the estimates of carbon in natural lands, both green and blue, be generated for future projections? So now thinking about the future for 2025, 2030, and 2050. Well, for the blue carbon, we can project this with and without coastal restoration, and we can do that with the Tier 2 approach. And then if we want green and blue carbon in the future, we would need the Tier 3 approach that can be conducted by USGS. So our suggestions are to use these two complementary approaches, Tier 2 and Tier 3, to assess both the blue and green carbon in natural lands of Louisiana. And just to review and summarize, why? Well, because the Tier 2 approach is currently assessing the 2017 Coastal Master Plan model output with and without restoration, and it can inform the Tier 3 USGS approach. The Tier 2 will also provide estimates per coastal habitat for baseline and future projections, again, with and without restoration. The Tier 3 USGS approach will expand the existing Lucas model to all of Louisiana and can represent both green carbon and blue carbon for baseline, so 2020, and future projections to align with the governor's goals. It can provide another independent estimate of green and blue carbon for baseline and future projections. And again, this would be the only estimate of inland wetlands that could be available for the state of Louisiana. And in addition, this approach can provide estimates with uncertainty for multiple scenarios of land use and climate change. And it can provide some spatially explicit output, so maps of carbon and emissions. So I would really like to thank GOCA and CPRA, so Harry Vorhoff, Lindsay, and Charles Sutcliffe for helping with this project, and Jim Paul from CPRA, my colleagues at the Water Institute, Bingqing Liu and Alyssa Dousman, and my colleague Leland Moss at Apt Associates. And I'm very thankful for Camille Stagg at USGS for helping me put together these slides. And both Camille and I are happy to take any questions.
Okay. Does anyone have their hand up? Richard, go ahead.
Hi, thanks, Melissa and Camille. I I'm curious about the choice of category here, what blue carbon is. You know, we think about blue carbon. The world thinks about blue carbon as ocean associated carbon. And for us, that kind of means ocean and coastal and a lot of coastal wetlands. But only about half of the wetlands in Louisiana are coastal, or at least half of the historical wetlands in Louisiana are coastal. And I'm wondering, what do you think we should do about handling those? Because I do think there's a substantial opportunity for changes there. So, for example, there's been more than 1 million acres of USDA farm bill incentive restoration to bottomland hardwoods from agriculture. That represents a tremendous opportunity for managing those for carbon, and something that I don't think, it doesn't look like it's going to be captured in your effort here. And I'm wondering how I'm sure you've thought about that, but I'm wondering how you see us handling that.
Yeah, that's a really great question, Richard. Thank you. So blue carbon can be also traditionally defined as tidally influenced. And I'm going to let Camille talk a little bit more about this. And that can be challenging in Louisiana to really draw that line of what habitats are in that tidally influenced area or not. And one area that comes to mind, and Richard, this well, is the Catahoula Basin and the importance of our fresh forested wetlands and their role in capturing and storing carbon. And so I do think that thinking more inland wetlands is important. And Camille has some ideas for that. I'm going to let her talk.
Sure, and thanks, Melissa, for a really great presentation. So yeah, Richard, this is something that we have thought about a lot as well when developing this methodology, especially for hopefully in the future application at the national scale. And so what we are doing and what we're planning to do is to err on the side of caution and just include all of those wetlands. And the way that we're doing that is by defining the coastal zone using a digital elevation model that defines the tidal boundary based on probability of tidal influence. And this has been published, James Holmquist published this in 2018, and it's a really nice mapping layer that defines the tidal zone as any area that has the probability of tidal influence or flooding at mean high water of 0.1% or greater. So it really does include almost all of that ecosystem that you're talking about, the bottomland hardwood forest, because there is some probability that they would be flooded under those conditions.
What about Catahoula Lake and inland Catahoula Lake and the refuges around those?
Yeah, that's also a good question. So we haven't done the rest of Louisiana. What we've only been working on right now is the Mississippi alluvial plain, so basically the deltaic plain. And what we've done in that area, which is ecoregion 73, is manually gone in. And so it's a lot of work, and it's taken a lot of time to go in and adjust the tidal boundary to make sure that we capture all of the coastal wetlands. And that's been a big job that we've been working on for the whole nation as well. Yeah. So it would be not an insignificant effort to expand it to the rest of Louisiana, because as you know, there are a lot of managed areas in coastal Louisiana. So just looking at elevation alone is not going to capture all of them.
And Camille, this Lucas model, so if we used it for forest land in Louisiana, is that basically what you're proposing, as opposed to those metrics that Alex and Richard and we talked about together? Would that be an alternative?
It would be an alternative, yes.
Okay.
It would be, like Melissa said, I think what we were talking about with Alex and Richard and Ning was more of a tier 1 approach. So, or maybe tier 2, looking at tabular data. So identifying a default factor, emission factor for given forest types for Louisiana, and then applying it to the aerial coverage for our state. whereas the Lucas model allows for tracking in space and time changes in carbon stocks and fluxes. So you have more flexibility with your scenario projections. And it also estimates uncertainty in space and in time as well. So it's more dynamic approach.
And Camille, with the Lucas model, as we get into the point of can we reforest, what's the benefit of reforesting, restoring wetlands, the Lucas model can be used by the subcommittees and the task force. What if we did a 40% increase in forestation and start more effort on preserving our wetlands? Could that not be a tool for how are we going to hit the net zero in 2050?
Yes, exactly. And that's why it was developed really as a tool for managers to use. And one of the great things about the model is that you can define those scenarios based not only on probability of transition from wetland to open water, for example, but you can define your scenarios based on targets, management targets. So just like you said, an increase in forest cover by 40%, what will that do to carbon sinks or carbon sequestration and fluxes? So that's what it was designed to do. And it's been used for that purpose in California, Hawaii, and also partially at the national scale. And so we just, our ongoing effort is to update the wetland class within that model. And we think it would be a really nice tool for Louisiana to use for that purpose.
Camille, and also Melissa, great job. The suggestion I would make, though, we've got to be very careful with units. I know Melissa showed that what you were calling the blue sinks showed a very high soils carbon sink. But if you take into account the vertical biomass and compare it an acre of forest to an acre of wetlands, the forest is about 2 to 3 times more net carbon sink in an annual year than a wetland would be. And if you looked at that chart, you think, oh my God, heck with the forest, it has no benefit. Let's put it all in wetlands. So I think we've got to be very careful when we get out of the scientific circles that we're working on a per acre per year or some agreed upon flux term that the task force and planners use. Science can get very deep among ourselves, but we've got to have a portal to be able to talk to the policymakers. And I just think we need to be really careful, because I could easily take that bar chart and misinterpret it to be that the name of the game by far is blue, not green. And we know we need both of them.
Yeah, I agree.
I agree.
Go ahead.
Go ahead, KT.
Yes, my question is somewhat about the model that you were using. Now, the IPCC model uses what considers the atmospheric CO2 uptake and into the water, and then uses a feedback model. That is, it changes the pH. The pH then changes the further uptake of CO2. So is that included in your Lucas model?
It can be, yeah. So what Melissa and I have been talking about using is coupling this model with the Louisiana Coastal Master Plan, which projects outputs of changes in land area based on climate change and land use change. So I can't remember exactly what climate models are used, but there are climate models used in the Louisiana Coastal Master Plan model. So we would have to look at those particular climate models, the groups of climate models that were used in the Coastal Master Plan. But we have used various different climate models coupled with Lucas. And the nice part about it is that you can link a climate model and to it through the different levers that the model has. So we have values for, say, net primary productivity. Well, if the climate model projects that we're interested in projects changes in NPP, then that's how we can link the Lucas model to that particular climate model.
Okay.
Okay.
Are there any numbers out there as someone who is outside of this field, I would like to know what is the potential of this blue carbon to on the capture and storage for an annual, and also what is the I mean, I know that's a difficult question, so maybe the most optimistic number, and also the cost associated with that per ton, for instance.
So Melissa showed a slide with numbers for carbon capture, or actually it's specifically the reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. So the net ecosystem carbon balance of wetlands for the whole nation is between 8.5 and 8.7 megatons of carbon, or megatons of, see, this is where the units come in, Mark. Here we go. CO2 equivalent per year. So that's the net capacity for reduction in greenhouse gas emissions for all of the United States. And so what we still need to do is the assessment for Louisiana, but just a rough estimate. Louisiana accounts for 40% of the nation's wetlands. So 40% of that is what Louisiana capacity is. And in terms of the cost, I can't speak to that at all, but maybe somebody else can, I'm not sure.
And in this, let me first go to Eric. Did you have a question, Eric, or is that an old hand up? You're on mute.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, my question was in relation to sort of imported pollutants, particularly with the Mississippi River and expressly with things like red tides off the coast of Louisiana, where we're losing oxygen supply in the water column. That's a coastal influence. I don't know whether that's good or bad from a carbon sequestration standpoint, but I would be interested in your opinion.
I'll let Melissa answer that one. That's her area of expertise.
Thanks. Yeah, that's an excellent question. And so the carbon that is part of red tides, that is phytoplankton or algae that are responding a lot to nutrients in our coastal waters. And so that carbon that is being produced will drive low oxygen in the bottom water, like on our continental shelf, right? That's why we have a dead zone offshore. And so that carbon is a little bit different than, I would say, than the carbon that is that we're thinking that's in our wetlands or in our forests, because that is very easily digestible. It gets decomposed pretty fast. It's offshore. So a lot of the carbon that we're interested for this study is about the carbon that is being produced by that vegetation that eventually gets buried in the soil and captured and stored, so that we really have this carbon sink.
So you're saying the red tides are something that's further offshore than what you would consider blue carbon?
Right. So yes, so they are still blue carbon, but they're a little bit more offshore. And I would say they're more, they would be accounted for in that lateral flux that we talked about. They're part of the aquatic pool of carbon. They're not necessarily what is going to be in the soil or in the above ground biomass that are the really big pools of where carbon is in our more wetland habitats.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, and note the comment in the chat from Richard about including both non-coastal and coastal wetlands in the inventory. And we need to time what we're doing here so that David can use it. Okay. My concern is that the Lucas model is not off the shelf for you to import and use directly right now. So
Right.
Camille, is this more of a long-term plan for the tier 3, or is this something that you are expecting to do during the next couple of months?
I think, well, right now it's not something that could be completed in the next couple of months, but I wanted to bring it up because of the potential use for it, and as far as how it would be incorporated. I think that's up to, you know, the advisory group and GOCA in terms of, you know, how to coordinate that. But the main point is that the EPA tool is a great tool, but it's missing a lot. And so we need to come up as a group. I think we need to agree on a strategy to account for these important ecosystems. And whether if it's Lucas further down the line or trying to prioritize that, I think that's something that we should discuss.
Okay.
Virginia, that could be a message that we send to the Agriculture Committee, because we got to be very careful as a SAG that we're primarily reviewing and giving input, not taking the lead away from the Agriculture Land Use Committee.
Mhm.
But at the same time, I agree with everybody saying we don't want to miss this opportunity to capture good carbon. That's why I think the work that y'all, you know, Richard and Camille, Melissa, the tables that we're calling them now, that's something that's readily available, and that could be handed off to David's team to be in the short term utilized. So, you know, don't give up on what you're doing, because I think we're going to need those numbers. But that gets David too. We have to keep in mind, we've got to have a tier 1 so we can match up with EPA and the states. But that's why I think having the value of a tier 2 or tier 3 effort in Louisiana is something we really need to do, because that's going to show the value of forest land and wetlands, both fresh and saltwater, to our state.
Okay. Well, we have this small working group that can continue to discuss this, what we can have in the short term, and then what needs to be done in the longer term for this really more accurate assessment that we need and the ability to project. So we can't resolve this today, but I think together this team that we've got needs to continue to collaborate. And David, we need to check in with you to be sure that what we're doing you can use and incorporate in the baseline for the 2020 report. So does anyone else have a burning question or issue they want to raise?
I just have a quick comment, if I may ask, Virginia. I would like to say that it's excellent that blue carbon, it seems, I mean, it's definitely a very relevant option for Louisiana. But with regard to cutting the CO2 emissions and with the ambitious goals that are set, for instance, by 2030, which translates to something around 100 megaton per year of reduction, probably with 4 megaton per year that we are seeing right now, it won't be able to, it's going to be difficult to promote it as a technology to cut the CO2 emissions in the short run, but is definitely a key technology when it comes to Louisiana to restore the coast, as well as also contributing to cutting the CO2 emissions. I would like to just emphasize that the way that this should be promoted or presented should not be necessarily in the context of meeting the goals that are set by the governor. That's it.
Yeah, I agree with you. Yes, it is. It's not the only way that we'll get to net zero. It's just one small component of the solutions that are going to be necessary to meet that emissions goal. But another component of that is that if, you know, without conservation of these lands, they can become a very significant source of emissions. And so not only are they sinks, but they're potentially sources that are significant as well.
Good point.
That I guess brings up maybe my only one question is can we do and I forget what, maybe you mentioned this, are we going to do effectively a master plan future with no action scenario for what would be lost if there was no master plan? That
Yes.
might be a way to get the potential sources.
Yeah, Alex, we are. So we're going to plan to do that in 2020, 2025, and 2050. We'll align it with the governor's goals and make those estimates.
Good. Excellent.
Thanks.
Okay. Well, so there's a lot of work underway behind the scenes. As you can tell, David's team and in this other team that's looking at carbon sequestration across the entire state, wetlands inland. Kind of the emphasis that came out today, I think, is important. And Dr. Kimes, commendations for us to be sure to include both aspects of wetlands in the state. So we'll convene this forest and coastal wetland carbon team to work together. And I know that we've got a time constraint in front of us pretty quickly with if we're going to have it input into the new report. So you'll get an update on this at our next meeting. This last section of our meeting today, I'm going to turn it over to Lindsay. Talks about we'll be going through this process for evaluating the state energy, the portfolio that will get us and the pathways to the net zero emissions. So this will be led by Colleen McHugh, but Lindsay, would you like to introduce Colleen and her energy innovation colleagues? Lindsay, you're on mute. Nope.
We might have finally broken the microphone on Lindsay's computer.
That's after our 9th meeting in 2 weeks. So Colleen,
I can go ahead and just tee us up.
Okay, she's gonna get on her phone too. Wait, she's gonna call up here, but go ahead and start if you'd like.
Okay. Can you all see my screen?
Yeah, pathway modeling, yes.
Okay. Great, so good afternoon. I'm Colleen McHugh. I'm a senior planner also with the Water Institute of the Gulf, and I'm supporting the governor's office on the planning team for the climate initiatives effort. I will be giving a very brief presentation on the process that we will be going through in close consultation with all of the advisory groups to evaluate the consequences of different portfolios of climate mitigation strategies, and how research and resources on emissions pathways will be part of that evaluation process. So I'll also describe approaches considered, and then I will tee up a presentation from Olivia Ashmore at the Energy Innovation on the Energy Policy Solutions tool, which is a publicly accessible tool that is currently being tailored for Louisiana that we will be using to support our planning and evaluation process. So to step back a little bit, ultimately, what we are trying to understand at this stage in our planning process is what does the future of Louisiana look like under different scenarios for reducing climate emissions? So both in terms of how well those scenarios help us reach our emissions goals, but also how they impact the other fundamental objectives that are driving this process. And so as a brief refresher on our process, we are using this structured decision-making framework to provide a systematic way to question, evaluate, understand, and communicate the impact of different emission reduction approaches on the fundamental objectives for the task force so that they are able to make an informed decision. So the goal is to stay focused on outcomes and to provide a mechanism for capturing and incorporating all of the input and expertise of advisory groups, sector committees, and the task force members, as well as the public as we go through this planning process. So step 4, forecasting the consequences, is really what we are starting with all of our advisory groups last week and this week. So all of the advisory groups will play a central role in this step in the SDM process. And we'll be doing this consequence analysis 2 times. First, to understand the impacts at that higher level, big picture scale of strategies. And that's what we're kicking off right now. And then the second round is where we'll actually bring in the details of actions that are being developed by the sector committees and by the public as we go through a sort of more refined, more detailed consequence analysis in the second half of this year. And so starting first with, what are the goals of this process, wanting to kind of frame what our goals of this first round of consequence analysis are. So we're doing this to provide a structured way for advisory groups to weigh in on the important considerations for how Louisiana reduces its climate emissions and the anticipated impacts of different scenarios. And in this first round consequence analysis, our goal is to frame for the task force really these three things: the realistic limits of strategies towards reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. And this is where we will be using information from the inventory and pathways research and tools to package information on this. And then the second two bullets, the potential impacts of hypothetical strategy portfolios on our other fundamental objectives and considerations necessary to have positive outcomes for Louisiana people, economy, and environment, are information that our advisory groups, all four of our advisory groups, will be weighing in on through an expert elicitation process. So starting with the what will we be asking our advisory groups to evaluate in this first round of consequence analysis? So the planning team will prepare and package about 3 to 6 portfolios of strategies. So again, just groups of strategies that represent different hypothetical future scenarios for evaluation. And these portfolios will be built from strategies that have been discussed by the sector committees and will intentionally frame sort of extreme alternatives in approach. I think one important thing to note here for this group is that, unlike with the Princeton pathways research, none of these scenarios in and of themselves will be net zero scenarios. Instead, we will be framing these as a sort of, what would this look like if we turned one knob all the way up? What is the most we can achieve under a given scenario? So the goal will not be for the task force to pick one. We know that we'll need a combination of multiple approaches, but we really want to use this first round consequence analysis exercise as a way to understand the bigger picture implications of different approaches and begin having the task force begin to set priorities for this effort. So we have not finalized, we have not finalized the specific scenarios, but just to give a couple of examples, one is just the business as usual. What does it look like if no strategies are implemented? And this one is important because we know that the do nothing, the future 30 years down the line does not look like life as we know it today. So we want to sort of evaluate that a bit more in detail. Another example, and this is just an example, we're finalizing these over the next couple of weeks, is renewable energy and electrification. Sort of what is the limit of net GHG emissions reductions that can be achieved if we pursue electrification and renewables to the fullest extent? And what are the potential positive and negative impacts to some of those other objectives in this process? And so what will we be evaluating these portfolios against? So as a reminder, through this process, the task force committees and advisory groups have already helped to identify 16 fundamental objectives following under the following 6 categories. So these are things that also matter to Louisiana in how we get to our climate mitigation goals. So reducing net greenhouse gas emissions is of course one of the sort of essential fundamental goals of this effort, but these other objectives have been identified as important considerations in how the state gets there. And we'll be using a slightly different approach to evaluating the impacts of scenarios in terms of net greenhouse gas emissions versus the other fundamental objectives. So for the non-greenhouse gas reduction objectives, we will be using a survey to elicit input from advisory members that we will send to all members, including the Science Advisory Group members in mid-April. So in about little over 2 weeks. The survey will ask members to provide both a score for the impact of each portfolio on a given fundamental objective, as well as a short narrative of considerations and key concerns. So all advisory group members will be sent the same exact survey, but asked to evaluate different objectives where the expertise of that group is best applied. And the survey will include, for each of those fundamental objectives, unique evaluation criteria, so that members are completing their evaluation grounded in a common rubric. So as an example, one of the objectives that the Science Advisory Group members will be reviewing is maximize preservation of natural resources and ecosystem services. So this is an incomplete example looking mostly at sort of coastal habitats here, but you can see where the criteria for each score on the scale includes a benchmark and clear qualitative or quantitative indicators. So I will kind of pause here for a minute. In consideration of our jam-packed sort of schedule today and limited time, I've sort of gone through the information on evaluating consequences of the hypothetical strategy portfolios against these non-greenhouse gas objectives extremely quickly. So I know that, but I would encourage you, if you have questions on this part of the process, to actually go and watch one of the other advisory group meetings from last week. We were able to focus a bit more on developing some of that criteria in those other advisory group meetings. And Lindsay provided a bit more detail in her presentation to those groups on the expert elicitation process. So, and we will also be, don't worry, following up with all of you with more information on this process very soon. But then to jump as well to look at our greenhouse gas emissions objectives. So the survey will be used to get input on the fundamental objectives that are non-greenhouse gas related, but we also know that we need to evaluate, of course, the greenhouse gas emissions of these hypothetical portfolios. So one way we are doing this is through emissions pathway modeling. And we researched and spoke with several companies about conducting various levels of modeling for our process. And given both our process and our very accelerated timeline in this sort of 1-year planning effort, you may, of course, also recall that Dr. Eric Larson presented on Princeton's recent national level pathway study at the all hands meeting in February. And emissions pathway modeling provides an evidence base to show that the strategies and actions, conditional or unconditional, identified in the climate action plan could deliver on the emissions trajectories and targets that have been established. So while none of the hypothetical strategy portfolios will be net zero, the planning team has researched how modeling tools could be used to estimate the greenhouse gas emissions impact of these portfolios. And Energy Innovation, who is here today with their partner RMI, hosts an open source tool called the Energy Policy Solutions Tool that can model emissions reduction scenarios. And very excitingly, and very aligned with our timeline, they are developing a state level version of the EPS tool for Louisiana. And I think we know, especially in this first round, that we're not going to have perfect information. And I think the goal here is to understand the big picture and to continue to work towards more detailed information and projections for when we look at the impacts of those potential portfolios of actions in that second round of consequence analysis. And as we look towards and work towards the best portfolio that will help us get to net zero by 2050. So the planning team will be using an initial version of this EPS tool for portfolio evaluation, but eventually we hope to make it part of the action development process and again, that evaluation of actions, as we think this information will be valuable to all stakeholders. So we really encourage the Science Advisory Group to examine the national level version of the tool and to see how it works. And Olivia Ashmore from Energy Innovation will walk us through in more detail the tool itself, how it's developed, and there will be time for questions sort of after her presentation. And so with that, I will stop sharing my screen and turn it over to Olivia Ashmore from Energy Innovation. Again, we are really excited that we are able to align the timing of this planning process with their timing for developing a state-specific version of the tool.
Thanks, Colleen. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Yep.
Great. Let me just share my screen. All right, so I am from Energy Innovation, which is I don't know if you all have heard of it already, but that was really great background, Colleen. But we're a nonpartisan think tank focused on energy solutions and climate policy. And we developed the Energy Policy Simulator, which is a tool to screen and analyze the impact of different climate policies. We've been working with RMI to do this for the states. We're joined today by June Shepard, who is our analyst from RMI, who's been developing a lot of the data we've been inputting into the models. We're planning to build out approximately 20 US states, and Louisiana is one of our first several states we're working on. The Energy Policy Simulator is designed to help policymakers understand the impacts of energy and environmental policies, find the best way to meet their climate, financial, and other goals, and make policy decisions that are unbiased and data supported. We've built these models out for many regions. We've mostly worked internationally in the following countries, and then we're building out, as I mentioned, several state policy tools. In total, we're currently covering about 54% of global emissions with our models. Our model takes in data from existing national models, so we try to use reputable forecasts, primarily from EIA's Annual Energy Outlook, EPA's Global Non-CO2 Greenhouse Gas Emissions projections, and NREL's Electrification Futures Study. And we account for the COVID-19 recession, and we forecast through 2050. So one thing I'll emphasize here is we're not trying to develop our own baseline of emissions. We're trying to take in existing data from sources. So for example, we would be able to incorporate some of the data from your greenhouse gas inventory once it's finalized and use that as a baseline for our model. Our model then layers on multiple different climate policies. And the goal here is to be able to look at a bunch of different policies and how they impact greenhouse gas emissions. We primarily use this tool as a screening tool to identify what are the most impactful policies and what are their economic and health impacts. You can create a situation where you layer on a bunch of different policies and develop a net zero emissions scenario. So Colleen talked about developing different scenarios, but one really exciting aspect of the tool is you can create your own policy scenario by selecting different policies and implementation schedules. And I'll show you how to do that in a minute. The outputs our model provides are detailed energy and climate outputs. So we provide greenhouse gas emissions by sector and source, energy consumption, electricity capacity by type, as well as health-related pollutants and premature mortality data, economic impacts such as on GDP, jobs, tax revenue, and changes in cash flow. Our model takes into account interactive emissions impacts. So for example, if you have a clean electricity grid and electric vehicles, you're going to get even more savings than either one of those policies on their own could provide. But for example, if you had clean electricity grid and energy efficiency, we take into account that the emission savings of those two policies combined will be less than, for example, energy efficiency savings on their own, because you've reduced the carbon impact of the electricity grid. Our model is built in a software called Bensum, which uses a systems dynamics model to analyze policy impacts. So all of our policies are interactive. For example, if you apply a building electrification policy that increases building electricity demand, our model will deploy additional electricity capacity to meet that demand. So all of these impacts interact with each other and provide specific stock data on like buildings, transportation, and electricity. I think you guys mentioned before, you're mostly working from a top-down model. Ours is a combination of a top-down and a bottom-up model. So we're working with different sets of data for different sources and sectors. I'm going to walk through a typical calculation flow for the transportation sector. We start with annual travel demand and annual vehicle distance traveled, as well as retiring vehicles. And this allows us to forecast the number of new vehicles needed. We can then figure out how those vehicles will be divided, for example, among gas versus electric vehicles, using data on new vehicle prices and operating costs. This is optimized and provides includes an endogenous learning impact. So the more electric vehicles deployed, the cheaper they get. This then takes into account fuel efficiency. So we take into account the new vehicle fuel efficiency, which impacts the overall stock fuel efficiency, and then ultimately estimates vehicle emissions. If you apply on a policy like an EV subsidy, that will feed into vehicle prices and then impact everything else down the line, as well as something like a fuel economy standard or a transportation demand management plan. This is just one sector of our model. We have transportation, as well as buildings, industry, ag, electricity, which all feed into the electricity sector of the model. We also have district heat and hydrogen, a CCS section of the model, and then kind of feeding into all of those is a fuel section of the model, which takes into account differing fuel prices by sector. And then a research and development section of the model, which will account for endogenous learning and additional research and development into different technologies. We also include land use, and all of this feeds into pollutants. So this is total, both greenhouse gas emissions pollutants and pollutants associated with health outcomes like PM 2.5 and NOx emissions. We also have all this data in terms of cost effectiveness and associated costs, which feeds into our cash flows model. We use an input-output model to forecast jobs and GDP changes from the baseline. So who uses this model? It's primarily policymakers, advocates, and regulators. And our model has been used by a bunch of different states already. And we've been working with the US Congress Committee on Climate Change to model their policy proposals. It's been peer-reviewed by national labs, universities, and global partners. And I can offer more information on that if you're curious. Our model is also entirely publicly available, so you can download and use the model, and it's fully documented online. Okay, now I'm going to give you a brief preview of our tool for the Colorado model, which we've already built out. Can you all see my screen still? Great. So this is our landing page for the Colorado energy policy model. If you can see this, the output graph selector, this provides categories of different graphs we have. So they're primarily divided into, there's emissions, financial outputs, health outputs, specific electricity, transportation, industry, and building and energy consumption. And then within those sectors, you can see different drop downs here as well, which can further divide by sector. So for example, total emissions here, we can divide it by sector and see industry, electricity, transportation, buildings, ag, and district heat. On this side is where you layer on the additional policies I mentioned. So we have built-in policies here, and they all have default settings and guidance. So we have kind of a description of how this policy works, how to set it effectively, and specific state data on what's already being done. You can also follow these links to find more information about how the model is working and how to best customize the data. We can do a little example here quickly. I'm going to flip to the CO2e wedge diagram, which is a really useful diagram for seeing the impact of different policies. I think I mentioned you can develop your own scenarios, but we have also built in a few customized scenarios here for Colorado. So we have the US 1.5 scenario, which is aligned with targets to meet a 1.5 compatible C target in 2030. And here you can see on this wedge diagram, there's the calculated impact of each policy. And we can see their impact in terms of climate emissions. And then the total impact on greenhouse gas emissions is this blue line down here. I'm going to highlight one other graph here, which is our CO2e abatement cost curve, which is similar to the McKinsey curve, if you have all seen that, which estimates the cost per ton of emissions by policy. I'll show one more that I think is really great, which is the avoided deaths wedge diagram, which is taking into account the reduced pollutants associated with burning fossil fuels, and then providing health outcomes data. So we have avoided deaths, avoided lost work days, avoided asthma attacks, avoided hospital admissions. So that's really helpful for taking into account some of the equity impacts. I'm going to pivot back to the business as usual scenario and do one example of how to set a policy. So if in Colorado we wanted to set a carbon-free electricity standard policy, we click on this. We can move the scale up as high as we want. Say like, yeah, 75% of electricity generation will be clean. And we'll watch and see that this line didn't move very much from the business as usual. So we could choose this customized implementation schedule and say we want that implemented by 2025 at 100%. And if we add that, we'll see it's implementing the full policy impact by 2025. And then we'll see this line come down. So that came down significantly as we saw the emissions from electricity are really reduced by 2025. And I will say we have developed a beta version of the Louisiana model, and it's online. So we have this tool behind a login screen currently, but once we are finished calibrating it and making sure our outputs are correct, we can share that login info with you to get additional feedback. But this will have all the same outputs, including some really exciting industry breakdowns of fuel use by sector and excluding and including feedstocks. Yeah, I'm happy to take questions now.
Thanks, Olivia. I wonder if you show, if you could show the predictions of, you're showing the predictions of CO2, but the technologies that contribute to that reduction.
The reduction in CO2?
Like, yeah.
Yeah, well, so in terms of technologies, we take into account like electricity generation and capacity, as well as transportation. So like vehicles by technology. So we actually predict a pretty high deployment of battery electric vehicle technology under a business as usual scenario. And then we also take into account some business as usual building energy efficiency. So we're drawing on data from the NREL Electrification Future Study, which predicts a certain amount of baseline energy efficiency in their model. Does that answer your question?
Thank you. Yeah, I think I'm gonna explore it more. Thank you.
Okay.
Olivia, Alex Kolker here. This is very thoughtful and very interesting. One of my questions for applying this to Louisiana is the externalities, right? So in Louisiana, you know, a lot of our things that are emitted here are related to things that are used elsewhere in the country. A lot of our emissions are industrial emissions, so it's fertilizer or fuel or petrochemicals that are manufactured here and then exported across the rest of the country. And so what happens to those emissions here are going to be closely tied with what happens with what the rest of the country decides for how they manage fuel or petrochemicals or fertilizer. How does that get incorporated into the decision-making process, right? Because the demand for fertilizer or the demand for fuel is going to impact what people do, what facilities do here in Louisiana.
Yeah, that's a really good and complicated question. I'll just start by saying that the scope of our tool covers in boundary Louisiana emissions. So if you're familiar with greenhouse gas inventory scopes, it's like scope 1 and 2 emissions within the state. So we don't include the emissions associated with the fossil fuels burned once they're exported from Louisiana, but we do take into account, or we estimate that. So I think if we pivot over here, we have an energy exports, imports, and production. So we can look at how much petroleum fuels Louisiana is exporting. And we assume this stays the same under a business as usual scenario, but that is a policy setting we can change. So if you want to assume the whole country is, reducing their fossil fuel consumption, and Louisiana as a result is exporting 25% less fossil fuels by 2050, that's something we could integrate into the model. But the baseline assumptions are essentially Louisiana would be acting isolated and kind of implementing climate action plans on their own, but the country as a whole isn't assumed to be implementing additional policy beyond what's currently in law.
Okay.
Does that answer your question?
So it's not in there, but you could add, it's not in there as a base scenario, but you could add that in there as like as a what if scenario.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, that sounds, that's good. I'll look under the hood and get back to you if I have more questions.
Yeah, sounds great. Any other questions I can answer?
I think it's going to take everybody a little bit of time to digest this, but this looks very exciting.
Yeah, and we're hoping to provide you all with a login soon. We rolled out Louisiana really quickly, so we're going to try to make sure our data looks good. And I think ultimately we'd really like to align to your business as usual emissions data, because we know you've done a lot of work to get that really accurate. So I think we'll hopefully be able to integrate your data.
Olivia, who funded y'all to develop this? I mean, this took a lot of time and thought process and science and programming. Who funded this?
Yeah, so the energy policy simulator is kind of a tool Energy Innovation has developed, and we are primarily funded by nonprofits to do this work. So we provide it entirely for free for any region we develop. And then I can't speak to who funds RMI, but maybe June could say if that's public, but it's all nonprofit funded.
So the effort to push out these state level energy policy simulators is currently funded by Bloomberg Philanthropies. But that said, we're funded by Bloomberg Philanthropies, but all of these tools are completely open access, open source, and will remain free in perpetuity. So it's a really big objective for both of our organizations to democratize data and make sure that everyone has the access to the same information.
Hi, this is Alyssa Dousman at the Water Institute, and I just wanted to thank you all, and just to let everyone on the SAG know that Colleen worked hard with Allison DeYoung, who couldn't make it today, to talk to these folks, because Louisiana actually was not going to be one of the first on their list, even though it was. And so, through developing a partnership with Energy Innovation and RMI, they pushed us up on the list. And as they indicated, they're doing this for free. So I just wanted to thank them for that, but then also just thank Colleen and Allison and the governor's office and Lindsay for having a lot of conversations to really make some of these tools tailored to Louisiana available to us. on a much shorter time frame of this task force, of this planning that's going on. So thank you all for that.
Thanks, Alyssa, for noting that. And members, I would say that as you explore this tool further, please feel free to send Olivia or I or June more questions on what this tool might look like for Louisiana and how we might be able to utilize it in our own efforts. I'll circulate Olivia's information as well as her presentation after this meeting.
This has been an excellent.
So I think in the,
and we appreciate
yeah,
it.
and
Echo what Olivia said, Alyssa said rather, and we are losing our panel members, our Science Advisory Group members. We've lost 4, so we probably ought to try to wrap up our meeting and take our public comments. And can you hear us now, Lindsay?
yes, can you all hear me?
Yes, yeah.
Okay, good. I called in on my phone, so that works better. Virginia, if it's all right with you, I'm going to run through a few next steps and then I'll lead us into our public comment.
Yes. Okay.
Okay, great. Colleen, do you mind sharing real quick your screen? So members, we have quite the stash of next steps for you all. You don't get off quite as easy as you did between the December and March meetings. We have a lot that we're pushing forward, so I thought it would be helpful if anyone is visual like I am to look through these next steps. I'll also circulate them via email in the coming days, just so you all are aware of where we're going forward and where we need you all to be plugged in. So as Mark identified, that he and Virginia and I will be sending out these teams of reviewing the inventory, and that will be assigned out based on your expertise and the relevant work that you do and the reason why you were put on this Science Advisory Group. And so we'll work with you all. Again, these are not formal public bodies. This is not changing the status of the inventory at all. This is really just a way to get some feedback and critical input from you all as experts in these fields. But I would say in addition to that, these are the next steps that I laid out for our other advisory groups, building on what Colleen discussed in her presentation on where we are in the process for all of you. So and that's on the left side of the slide. In this late March meeting, we've begun to develop some of these different emission reduction scenarios and understand the consequence analysis. And we're beginning to put together that evaluation criteria based on some input we've received from some of our task force members. And we're going to turn that into a survey that will circulate to you all in mid-April. And just to note on the right side, in late April, we know that you all might have questions on answering the survey or want to discuss more what some of these hypothetical scenarios are. So we'll have a brief office hour session just for you all to come in and ask questions that you might have on filling out that survey. Since you'll have about a month to fill it out, there will be no rush, and so we'll get to have some time to answer any questions in late April. And then sandwiched in the middle is when you all will cross over to the action development process that all of our committees are going through. As our chairwoman, Virginia, framed really well at the beginning of this meeting, the committees have just met and begun working through their action development. So you all will cross over through that advisory lens and provide a cross-disciplinary review of some select draft actions and themes, working with all of them around that. So Colleen and I will assign you all to one of those working sessions. As I mentioned in an email last week, we're going to have about 6 working sessions between April 14th, 15th, and 16th, and you all will just be assigned to one. So you might be with a few other members of the SAG, or you might be the only science advisory member on that group. We really want to just toss up all of the groups and get some great cross-pollination among the different groups that we have. So we will be emailing you out those groups that you'll be a part of in the coming week or so that you have a little time to prepare. But those are the real benchmarks of what is coming up, alongside reviewing the inventory components that will be emailed out in the EPS tool as well. And Colleen, if you can advance one more slide. There's also, as I mentioned, the action development process that is going on at the committee level, but we do recognize there's a need for some cross-cutting implementation priorities, including scientific advancement relevant to you all, and then relevant to our other advisory groups, climate equity and transition and governance and finance. And so just wanted to offer to you all a reminder of the action template proposals that we're developing with the committees, but also would love to hear your cross-disciplinary input on as well. So I can recirculate that template that's available in English and Spanish and Vietnamese publicly, but also for our committees, advisory groups, and task force members. And I'll circulate these next steps as well when we provide a follow-up to you all. But that's the comprehensive overview of where we're moving next over the next month. And if there are not any questions on that, I will move into our public comment period. And I will check our climate email. But if I know there are a few attendees in the webinar mode. And so if there's anyone interested in raising a public comment, please just raise your hand and I will let you into the webinar. And I don't see any hands raised, nor do I see any comments over our email, but we'll wait just one more minute. See if anyone has a comment. Seeing none, I will pass back over to the chairs to close us out.
Okay. Mark, why don't you close us out today?
Oh, okay. I get the honors. Everybody's been waiting for this. Want to thank everybody for all your hard work that you've done and that you will be doing. Like a lot, but it's very important. So if there's no other comments or anything, I want to thank everybody for their hard work, and y'all have a good afternoon. Lindsay, are we clear to go?
Can you make a motion to adjourn?
How about I make a motion to adjourn? Do we have a second?
Second.
Alex. Monica, Eric. Okay, several seconds. Mindy. Maggie.
All right. Well, since do we have everybody raise their hand who's for closing? Anybody opposed?
It'll go from a hand wave to a hand wave to a wave. Goodbye.
A double. Without any opposition, we then are formally closing our meeting. And Lindsay, we appreciate it, and we'll be talking to everybody very soon. We'll get that list out shortly. Thank you, everybody, and y'all have a good evening.
Thank you.
Farewell.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.